back again with my incredibly strong coffee, which has given me all the power, all the hype to sit here in a room that is absolutely sweltering. It's one of the worst things about recording. You got to, lock up all the windows and doors to stop any sound from travelling in. So it gets quite warm in here. And speaking of warmth, climate change, eh? Oh, that climate change. To be honest, I think I looked forward to climate change more when it was global cooling, like the whole idea that the world is just suddenly going to get a whole lot cooler. What was it? It was that movie, A Day After Tomorrow or something like that. Just a snap freeze, froze everything in place and killed everyone. I like that. I prefer the cold. This heat can surge right off. Although you can tell how Essex you are when it's really, really sunny and the first thing you think is, right, I need to take my top off, go buy a bottle of Corona and a pack of 20 Sovereign. Go sit in a park for about half an hour. Now, there is the tendency for when a person doesn't quite toe the party line on climate change to sit there and say that, you're a climate change denier. And that party line is sort of roughly along the lines of, oh my God, the world is heating up. Everyone's going to die in like 10 years time. This is such a huge, major, important problem. And we need all the green technologies, all now. To be honest, we needed them like 10 years ago. Let's all blame the oil companies. Just keep throwing money at climate change until it goes away. Keep throwing money at solar panels and wind farms until, the polar bears stop dying or some shit. And this party line is so reinforced, and to talk against it is seen as heresy. So allow me to put my position down. Climate change is a very real thing. Humans probably aren't helping matters. To be honest, we're probably making it worse. We're probably speeding climate change up beyond its natural pace. However, I think we don't quite know what steps to take in order to address climate change. Or rather, we don't seem to understand the length of time needed and the sacrifices that will be needed to tackle something like climate change. So when someone like Donald Trump, President of the United States, leader of the free world, pulls out of the Paris climate change agreement, people on the internet lost their collective shit. They went nuts, to be honest. And you do have to sit there and wonder just how much of their collective outrage is based upon a reasoned and pragmatic approach to tackling climate change, and how much of it is based upon them just simply not liking Donald Trump. How much of it is partisan and how much of it is personable. And again, you see memes online that demonstrate this lack in trust of elites and lack of trust in authority and in power that we saw in the previous segment. You have people sitting there saying that Donald Trump is in bed with big coal, big oil. He's got corporate ties. He dismantled the EPA because he wants to sell the land off to open up for fracking and all of these things. And it very much is this idea that there is no way you can trust those in power to set out and do the things that they say that they will do. However, I then have to ask, why do you have trust in a supernatural organisation like the United Nations? I mean, what we've seen, especially across the US and Europe over the past couple of years, has been a full-on rejection of the establishment. We saw that with the election of Trump. We saw that with Brexit. We've even seen it with Emmanuel Macron in France, and he was presented as the outsider, anti-establishment candidate. Heck, even Corbyn is being framed as someone who is anti-establishment, anti-elite. But it almost seems to be that publics still want established elite oversight of something like climate change control. And again, this isn't to say that Donald Trump can't tackle climate change on his own. I mean, I'm sure that there is an argument to be made that as technology develops, the harmful emissions will be cut down as there is more interest in things like greener technologies, more commercial interest there is in stuff like a lower carbon footprint, more organic foods, less greenhouse emissions. There would be companies who would be willing to change their practices to address these market concerns. And if not, there will be new companies being set up who will cater directly to these markets. And I mean, we see it with most of the oil companies in their own mission statements and things like that. They sit there and say that they reinvest money into developing technologies. They try and lower their carbon footprint. And even on a smaller scale, look at the rise in things like the acceptance in vegetarianism and veganism. People going vegetarian and vegan to try and limit their impact on the world. And obviously there are now restaurants, cafes, all of these things that are being set up to cater for that need in the market. And it almost seems to be too easy to sit there and say that a politician like Donald Trump, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, means that he wants to destroy the environment. But again, looking at the actual raw politics of it, that doesn't make much sense. Someone like Donald Trump got an awful load of support from Heartland America. People who do live in very close contact with the wilderness. Hunters, farmers, people like that. People who need there to be a clean enough climate in order to make a living or indulge in their recreational activities. People who, if they started losing massive swaths of land, will be less inclined to vote for Trump in the next election coming up. And as I've said in previous podcasts, we seem to be conflating the two issues of global warming and pollution. It strikes me as being interesting that there was a video from Arnold Schwarzenegger, the old governor of California, the state of California, and he's sitting there and he's castigating Donald Trump, sitting there saying that our children will face a future of asthma and emphysema, but yet Californian cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco are some of the most polluted cities in America. And even under Schwarzenegger's tenure, there's been very, very little that's been done to tackle these problems. And sticking with the politics for a bit, it kind of does make sense at a political or supranational, that's the word I'm trying to say. It makes sense at a supranational level for Trump to essentially take his ball and go home. Because when we talk about nations failing to address climate change, global media seems to have a real big hard-on for attacking America. When I last checked, America made up about 18% of global emissions, whereas China makes up over 30%. And then, of course, you get to the actual funding structure of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Within the introduction, the framework is designed so that wealthier nations, those nations with greater access to resources, subsidize poorer nations who produce less emissions. If anything, it should be all nations subsidizing the nations who need it the most, which would be America and China. More funding for those countries to be able to instigate green technologies, to be able to limit their carbon emissions and develop the technologies that they need to. So if anything, Trump is trying to, if he was to stick with the Paris Climate Agreement, he'd be fighting the climate change war on two fronts, subsidizing global climate change initiatives, as well as trying to tackle initiatives on the North American continent. Not only that, he would be absolutely lambasted by global media for failing to reach targets, which he's gonna. There's very few countries that actually manage to stick and meet their targets while still being able to supply the demand of energy needed to the citizenry. And at the same time, China makes out like gangbusters. Very, very few people are interested in Chinese attempts to tackle climate change. And then, of course, the argument would be, okay, but what about the poorer nations? How would they be able to develop reasonable energy policies without extra funding being directed to them? Well, the argument there would be that as nations such as America and China further develop their own technology, that technology is going to become cheaper. There is going to be older technologies that could be exported to somewhere like India, somewhere like Brazil. Actually, Brazil's pretty green, which would be miles ahead of what that nation itself could actually produce and operate. So again, while it's easier to talk about the redistribution of wealth and the redistribution of resources to combat climate change, there appears to be little redistribution of responsibility. And it's actually quite sad when you see journalists jumping on the let's hate Trump train because, hey, he wants to destroy the world, rather than actually investigating how the money is being used, where is the money going that's being funneled through the United Nations? Is the money actually going to the initiatives that it says it's going to, or is it mostly just paying for bureaucracy? What specifically is being done to address the issues in supplying the level of energy needed cleanly to the countries who demand it the most? Because even then, one of the big concerns about the Paris Agreement is that there is no standardized mechanism for countries to produce their baseline emissions output. It can vary from nation to nation. And even then, there's no mechanism in place to ensure that nations will actively seek to lower their emissions. You could have somewhere that has reasonably low emissions and then instigate a 10-year program of setting up new coal-fired power stations. Especially as Western nations are getting rid of that older technology, there will be southern nations who sit there and say, yeah, we'll buy that on the cheap. Doesn't really matter that it's more polluting. We get cheaper energy. Great. The price in coal is falling as people move towards fracking and gas and oil. Great. Again, you'll have these southern nations who are more than happy to buy coal that is in low demand, and as such will have a lower price. Those nations will be able to increase their emissions output whilst not contributing monetarily to tackle climate change. If anything, they'd be receiving subsidies to tackle climate change whilst producing more emission. And again, we see this money being used to construct solar fields in the Middle East and stuff like that, you know, massive fields of solar panels, which is great, but that's not where the overwhelming amount of the emissions are. As I stated before, it comes from America, it comes from China, India, Russia, EU. These nations for years have been the biggest polluters, the biggest producers of greenhouse gas emissions. These are the nations who genuinely have made steps to try and improve their emission standards over the past 20 or so years, at the same time as seeing massive increases in population. And again, while it's easy to sit there and claim, let's just all go to wind and solar, the ability to provide is not there yet. Germany, for example, has a very, very good wind and solar energy structure in place. But there are times when they are at an energy deficit and they have to purchase their energy from other nations at an inflated price. And then, of course, there are times that they have energy surplus and then they have to sell it to nations at a drastically reduced price. And the end result is energy is simply more expensive for the average person. When I say average person, you know, the people earning, what, less than £26,000 a year? That is the median income, 26 grand. I mean, look at your own finances and sit there and say, how much more are you willing to pay to keep the light on? How much more can you pay to keep the light on for a little bit longer in winter? And this is the inherent difficulty with tackling something like climate change, trying to do what is quote unquote best for the world whilst also maintaining a quality of life for your citizenry. And we see it in the UK when, you know, there's big worries about fuel subsidies for old age pensioners. When we hear about, you know, old people dying and even kids dying because, you know, they can't keep their houses warm during winter. And everyone gets all outraged at things like that, but it is cheap energy that allows people to do it. It's cheap energy that allows them to, well, live. So it's very easy to sit there and write opinion piece headlines like Donald Trump poisons the world. You do have to sit there and ask yourself just how much of these headlines are designed to get people to click on them, either because they want to sit there and revel in what that dumb Donald has done today, or they want to get angry at what these leftist pundits are putting out there for their audience. We almost seem to have ignored the question of what are you doing to tackle climate change? And I don't mean that as in a what are you as an individual doing? We had that rhetoric during the late 90s, early 2000s. And it's not that hard to sit there and see that while it was people who bought the energy saving light bulbs and only filled up the amount of water that they needed, companies and institutions, and I lived across the road from the Guardian, I saw it, left their lights on all night, left computers on all night. You know, you'd go into schools, they'd be like, right, today we're going to teach you about climate change, you know, you should really turn your lights off. And you go, yeah, but you've got how many lights on throughout the day? They go, yeah, but we need them on. We do. And it's seeing inconsistencies like that that might lead people to start questioning the sincerity behind addressing climate change. But whether you're overreacting to Donald Trump withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, or you're overreacting to a risk that vaccines can harm your child, both of these speak to a level of uncertainty. We don't know what will happen. We, the average people who do our regular 9 to 5, even the politicians don't really have an idea what they're doing. They're listening to experts who they just hope have the right position on things. And whilst even the experts are still trying to work out exactly what is the best foot forward, you have those media personalities who will happily capitalize on your fear, on your dread, and they will spin you a story that you want to hear. This is one of the big worries about doing this podcast, because I don't want to tell you what you want to hear. I don't want to tell you who the enemy is, who's doing things wrong out there, because for the most part, people are just trying to do what they think is right. Maybe they're a little bit misinformed. Maybe they've believed the wrong people. But deep down, whether you're a parent who's thinking about vaccinating your kid, or you're the leader of the free world, contemplating the best way to tackle climate change / pollution, however you want to reframe that one, both sets of people are trying to do what they think is best in light of not having a clear path forward, especially at a time when almost every institution now is seen as corrupt. Every institution now is seen to be in it for themselves, and all we hear about is the problems with the world rather than people coming up with solutions. Even if those solutions are tiny, they're small, they're little things that will only impact the immediate area in which they live. And you know what? Maybe a world where everyone sits there and tries to improve their own little patch of earth. Maybe that's a world worth living in. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this podcast. This was fun getting back to it after 2 weeks. A lot of coffee, a lot of hype. If you got a mate who you think would also enjoy listening to this podcast, link it to them. Be like, I listen to this. I ain't gonna be your friend anymore. Back you did when you was a kid. As always, you can follow this podcast on SoundCloud, subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube. All that good stuff. I have been Martin Rooke, and I will see you all again next week.